So recently, Diablo Immortal pissed off a large part of the online gaming community, including me. And in my critique of the game, I noticed that Immortal shares a number of similarities with Diablo 3. After putting out that video, I thought a lot about that comment. I wondered, was I warranted in saying that Blizzard made Diablo Immortal to be a mobile version of Diablo 3 with a predatory cash shop to buy progression and power? To answer that question, I decided to do what I said I would exactly not do back in my first impressions video. I reinstalled the game, started a new character, and tried one more time to review Diablo 3. In other words, Diablo Immortal was so bad that it made me want to give Diablo 3 a second chance. But this time I wasn't going to be a wide-eyed newbie. I was going to follow all the advice that was given to me in my first impressions video and play Diablo 3 the right way. For those of you who don't know, the generally accepted way to play the game now in Season 26, 10 years after its release, is to completely forget that the campaign exists. You do have to complete it once, but after that you can start a character in the seasonal game mode. The seasonal game mode is basically what you would expect. Every so often the devs come in, change a few minor things up, and reset your seasonal characters. It's something a lot of games do nowadays to keep things fresh for veterans, so points to the Diablo 3 teams for sticking with it, even if it's not the most substantial content. So what do you do to level in seasonal mode? Bounties, and lots of them. Technically you can do Nephilim Rifts too, but until level 70 when I opened Greater Rifts, I didn't find Nephilim Rifts to be all that helpful or interesting. Bounties were much faster, and they gave me a ton of XP and items when I completed an entire map of them. I don't know if it was a more efficient leveling process for sure, but it was definitely more interesting. Running Nephilim Rifts over and over, especially when you don't have all your skills or gear yet, is a bit boring. Leveling was pretty fast, albeit extremely monotonous. The majority of bounties were basically the same, just with randomized elites to hunt down or chests to cleanse and open. But at least it sent me out into the world and kept a quick pace for completion. Every time you complete a bounty, there's a bit of fanfare and a quick ingest of XP, which at least for the lower levels, always ended in a level up. So it gave a good sense of accomplishment. Then, once you finish all the bounties on a map, you can talk to Tyrael in the base camp and he gives you a bunch more XP and items as an extra reward. If Diablo does anything right, it definitely makes you feel good about completing simple and repetitive tasks. But leveling isn't the fun part. The fun starts at level 70. From there, you start to earn Paragon levels and can directly influence the building of your character with Paragon points. I will say that once I got to level 70, I did start to have much more fun. The combat is precise and weighty, the movement is fluid, and even without binding a click to move, I got used to the movement pretty quickly and rarely got caught in anything I wasn't trying to kill. At level 70, you unlock Greater Rifts, and I believe this is the pinnacle of Diablo 3 endgame. How quickly can you clear a Greater Rift and at what difficulty? As your gear becomes stronger and stronger, you can clear rifts faster. You raise the difficulty, and you get better loot. This means that the endgame in Diablo is fairly straightforward. You have your Nephilim Rifts, which give you the Greater Rift keys. The Greater Rift keys allow you to enter Greater Rifts, which provide lots of loot and Paragon experience. You have bounties which are still quick to complete, but give you the much needed Heraldric caches, which give you necessary crafting materials. Crafting materials can be used to upgrade or craft weapons and armor, but I found that the main use for the materials is to engage with Kanai's Cube. Kanai's Cube is basically your legendary crafting tool. You can upgrade rares into legendaries, you can extract legendary powers from legendary items, and you can replace legendary powers that already exist on a legendary item. This seemed to be the focus of the endgame crafting, and your number one location for upgrading or creating your most powerful items, including those that are part of a set. Overall, Diablo sort of handholds you to set you off on the endgame path. You have this UI that tracks all of your seasonal challenges, which once each challenge is completed, you get a small reward. Once a full list of challenges is completed, you get a larger reward. Through these challenges, I was given set pieces to one of my class armor sets. Not only that, but each challenge shepherded me to where I needed to go next or what my next goal might be. So let's look a bit further into each pillar of the endgame. Rifts were probably the most fun part of my endgame experience, simply because it allowed me to progress my character while feeling overwhelmingly powerful, smashing demons to bits with little to no downtime in between. It really served one singular purpose for me: enjoy the combat and watch the big numbers be big. But that simplicity is kind of what made it fun. I didn't have to think about what I was doing. I was watching TV on one monitor and decimating hordes of demons on the other. And with this beautiful balance of entertainment fulfilling my ever-decreasing attention span, I was actually happy playing Diablo 3. I attribute that mostly to the unrivaled feel of the combat, but part of that also had to do with the crafting system and creating my build. I don't particularly enjoy that the majority of my loot stats didn't feel meaningful, but I do like that I started to be more in control over my build. For example, most of my time playing, I had a belt that increased my barbarian's frenzy damage by 300% and took on the power of every rune customization. I was unstoppable, and the gameplay had me running around one-shotting every single minion and deleting bosses like they were last year's Gucci Prada. I was left-clicking everywhere, wiping the entire entire rift clean, and even though it was extremely repetitive and had zero depth, it was still incredibly satisfying. It fell into this extra category, the one that roguelikes tend to fall into, where you're supposed to find a power-up or a skill that makes you feel overpowered for a while. The point of the game is to make you feel like you're unstoppable until you get to a difficulty where you are simply overwhelmed. And once I got to the end game, I was given a class set belt that changed up my gameplay entirely. Now combat was no longer a left-click marathon, but instead I had my Furious Charge skill buffed to the extreme. So I used a rune that gave me 3 charges for that skill, and I furiously bulldozed every enemy I came across. Not only did I buff my Furious Charge, but I also used Kanai's Cube to extract the 300% damage increase to Frenzy from my old belt and put it onto the new one. So now I can charge at groups of enemies and one-shot them with Frenzy instantly. This fed my power trip to the max, and I'm sure as I unlock new sets and extract legendary powers, I can make my character super overpowered to climb that difficulty ladder that had annoyed me in my first impressions video. I also think that it makes sense that you need to go out into the world and collect resources to craft your items, and I felt it was perfectly justified that the crafting materials you need for legendaries were given as rewards for clearing maps of bounties. And I will mention that once you hit 70, or maybe it was always there and I just didn't notice, there are new places to go, including the area that you have to clear to retrieve Kanai's Cube and unlock it for your use. This makes the rest of the world feel important in some way, even if it's a very small part of the game. The seasonal challenge tracker is actually a super helpful tool. I wouldn't necessarily say it was a fun thing to interact with, nor was it entirely engaging to complete some of the tasks, but it gave you a direction so that you at least understood how to progress your character further than just leveling and dropping loot. I think it's a good bit of game design. As a player, you are incentivized to complete seasonal challenges, not only to get large amounts of XP and gold, but this is an extremely easy way to get your first bit of class set armor. It also incentivizes you to engage with parts of the game that you wouldn't normally find or think of. That way, you feel that there are other things to do in the world, and you don't just sit in a sanctuary and spam greater rifts, even if it's just for a couple minutes. And that's where the game falls short. The strength of Diablo 3 is in its smooth, visceral combat with overpowered abilities and big damage numbers. The problem with this, though, is that there is little to no content variation to go along with it. Once you complete the seasonal challenges, or if you get bored with completing bounties or running rifts, you're out of gameplay. The endgame pillars create content that is extremely repetitive and follows a very simple gameplay loop that gets tiresome fairly quickly. Run a Nephilim Rift to get a Greater Rift key, run that Greater Rift to get better loot, up the difficulty, then run another Nephilim Rift to get another Greater Rift key, and get better loot. Craft a legendary or extract legendary powers until you run out of materials, complete the same monotonous bounties to get more materials, then play with your legendaries some more until you run out of materials. So overall, complete a rift, adjust your loot or the difficulty, and complete another rift. The overall gameplay loop is pretty simple, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, but when you add in the fact that each rift is basically the same with small randomized variations, there really isn't anything to keep your attention after a while. You could say that the challenge of increasing the difficulty and beating the run timer is good replayability, but again, you're basically just doing the same thing over and over again, hoping that you can increase your damage numbers bit by bit. I also still have a slight problem with how the difficulty system works. I know this is something that other players enjoy, but I personally don't like that you have to adjust the difficulty to your own ability. In other games, the difficulty comes from the game and your progression through it. As you get further in the story and complete puzzles or encounters, the game gets more difficult. As you go from a starting area to a higher level area, the monsters are stronger, hit harder, or have more abilities. The difficulty scales off your progression curve, and even though the player can influence it, the game will dictate the difficulty on its own, with you rising to meet the challenge with your skill or power levels. In Diablo 3, you're playing the same content, completing the same rifts, the same bounties, but altering the difficulty yourself to create your own sense of progression. There's nothing different about each tier of difficulty, just bigger damage and health bars. So not only is it repetitive content, but the progression is artificial. You aren't getting better at the game, you are just getting stronger gear. Other ARPGs have a similar design to their endgames, but they tend to have other content that affects the gameplay. For example, PoE has you clearing maps to progress through the endgame. It requires you to defeat a bunch of monsters and a boss to complete that map. If it was only that, it would have little to no variation. But PoE adds in map tiers as difficulty, meaning that the game decides the challenge, and when you feel ready, you can attempt that map. In addition, every map has modifiers which affect the content. Sometimes monsters have more health or damage, sometimes they emit lightning damage or whatever, but regardless of the change, whether it's something small or big, it's variation. In addition, the whole point of mapping is to get to endgame bosses, which adds a tangible goal to the endgame rather than just beating your personal time record on a certain difficulty. It's not perfect and it's much more complicated, but it keeps your attention and it gives you a challenge that's worth overcoming. So my critique for Diablo 3 is equal parts repetitive content or lack of any variation, and having to manage your own feeling of progression because of that repetition. And that resulted in a very specific type of game for me. Diablo 3 ended up being the type of game that I load up and play for 30 minutes while I'm watching TV. It's my second monitor content. The combat and visuals make it incredibly fun to mindlessly grind through for a little while, but it has no depth to keep my attention for long periods of time. But I understand now why this game has a dedicated fanbase, and why it's a comfort game or a couch co-op game for so many of you who commented on my last video. There is definitely value in having a game that's lighthearted, easy to understand, and quick to get into the action. Even after finishing the review, I did find myself feeling drawn back to it. I'd be done with work, come back from the gym, hung out with my family, had dinner, and played another more engaging game, then have 30 minutes before I need to go to bed. That 30 minutes would be filled with Diablo 3 demon slaying and watching TV, and it was probably the most relaxing part of my day. I could turn off my mind and watch the damage numbers delete everything around me. Overall, I think repetition is the main problem with Diablo. If the fluidity of the combat and the big damage numbers is the main focus of the game, then more content is needed to be able to engage with that. Diablo 3 has its merits though. It has its place in the top of the ARPG list, granted it's 10 years old and has minimal seasonal support. But I'm going to rant a bit about the future now. I think enjoying the game like I have for the second look review almost makes me more sad that I'm not excited for Diablo 4. That's not exactly Diablo 3's fault. That's Activision Blizzard and their most prominent recent quality of being able to take beloved IPs and extort them and their fanbase for every penny they have. Diablo Immortal is so bad that I just don't believe Blizzard won't ruin Diablo 4 for profit. Or maybe the game will be super fun, with all the things we love about Diablo and more, but it'll have some sort of controversial issue like the Real Money Auction House was for Diablo 3. There's just no shortage of Blizzard fuck-ups right now, and I feel bad for Diablo fans for the way they were treated with Diablo Immortal. I'm a World of Warcraft veteran having played since 2007, and I can tell you that the number of fuck-ups it takes for WoW players to admit that their game is not perfect is ridiculous, and it sucks to feel like the next WoW expansion is coming, but having little faith in Blizzard to make it worthwhile. And WoW is a constantly updated game with major patches roughly every 6 months. I can't imagine what it would be like to wait 10 years for a new Diablo game, and for it to be half-baked with the worst predatory monetization we've seen to date. Either way, until Diablo 4 comes out, we're stuck with what we have. And if you're deciding between Diablo Immortal or Diablo 3, I would say try Diablo 3. It's the same damn game, just without the pay to win. But most importantly, I hope you enjoyed the video. Leave a like if you liked it and subscribe for more content. I hope you enjoy your adventures in Sanctuary, and I can't wait to see what we talk about next.